Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, an apology that we were struck by the Zoom gremlin that closed us out for about 5 minutes there. But thanks to our tech team for reconnecting us. Let me say, first of all, I welcome you all. My name is Paul Ure. I'm the director of the Faraday Institute here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, both our in-person, real-life guests here in Cambridge, and to those of you joining online. You're all very welcome indeed. So, as always, welcome to the first of our seminars in this new year. And as always, because it's a seminar, we very much welcome your participation in the question and answer session afterwards. So today, it's my special pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Sharon Dirckx, who's an international speaker, in fact, an author, and also the senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. She took her first degree in biochemistry and then did a PhD in brain imaging from the University of Cambridge here. And she's also held research positions in the University of Oxford and in the Medical College in Wisconsin in the United States. She's written several books on very challenging subjects, including the problem of suffering. And her latest book, Am I Just My Brain?, brings together neuroscience, philosophy, and theology to the subject of human identity. So she's extremely well qualified to be our speaker today on the subject of neuroscience and free will. Are we just driven by our brains? And it's my pleasure now to hand over to Dr. Dirckx.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. My apologies that I'm not in Cambridge in person for those of you that are in the room. Let me just bring up my slides. Here we are. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you on this subject. Thank you to all of those who have joined online to hear what someone might say to the question, are we just driven by our brains? Because we make decisions all the time, sometimes fairly mundane decisions like what to eat for breakfast, or maybe that's not a mundane decision for some, that's very important. And also, you know, decisions that are more significant, like where to live or whether or not to marry and what to do for a career. We make all kinds of decisions all the time. And our decisions seem to us to be real and impactful. But are they genuine, or are they just a product of our brains? And the backdrop to this whole conversation is one in which some philosophers and neuroscientists hold the view that we are our brains. In other words, that our brain defines us, the choices we make for good or ill, the personality that we have, the behaviors we exhibit, even the religious beliefs that we may or may not have. These are all driven by the activity of our brains. And perhaps one of the most well-known proponents of this view was Francis Crick, who co-discovered the DNA double helix and won the Joint Nobel Prize in 1964. Well, later, Crick went on to say this about human beings. He says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And one of the implications of Crick's view is for free will, as he himself says. If we are just our brains, are our decisions simply the product of synapses firing? Are we really free and able to make decisions in any meaningful sense, or do we just do what our brains tell us? And I'm also, as we begin this conversation, I'm mindful that many Christians do not necessarily believe that we have an unhindered free will, but for theological reasons rather than neuroscientific ones, but today I will be focusing on the conversation in neuroscience, although I recognize that this is a wider conversation as well. Now, a well-known proponent is a neuroscientist who is also an atheist, someone called Sam Harris. And Sam Harris is a philosopher and a neuroscientist, and has written a lot on the interaction of neuroscience with the human persons. And he begins his book Free Will by describing a fairly brutal attack on a family in Connecticut that was only intended to be robbery and yet ended with 4 counts of murder. And Harris makes sense of events in an extraordinary way. You see, according to Harris, the attackers could not have done any differently, even if they had wanted to. The violence inflicted on that day was a product of their genes and upbringing over the long term, coupled with their brain activity and anatomy in the moment. And Harris reflects, and I'll just start a little bit earlier than this quote. As sickening as I find their behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with one of these men, atom for atom, I would be him. If I had been in Komisarevsky's shoes on July the 23rd, 2007, that is, if I had had his genes and life experience and an identical brain in an identical state, I would have acted exactly as he did. There is simply no intellectual position from which to deny this. The role of luck, therefore, appears decisive. How can we make sense of our lives and hold people accountable for their choices, given the unconscious origins of our conscious minds? Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from the background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. So what are we to make of this view that free will is illusory on scientific grounds? Do science and philosophy necessarily take us to this place? Do our conscious minds have unconscious or non-conscious origins? Well, the position that Harris takes here is what's known as hard determinism, where determinism is defined as the belief that prior causes guarantee a particular outcome. For example, Harris held that Komisarevsky's behavior was driven by several prior causes: his genes, a genetic determinism that he is a product of what he inherited from his parents; secondly, his upbringing, social determinism, that he was a product of his background and social context; and also his brain activity on the day, neuronal determinism or anatomical determinism, a product of his brain structure and function. And according to Harris, if he himself had had those same prior causes, he would have acted in exactly the same way. In other words, the brains that we have are akin to machines that operate according to fixed processes, such that there is no free will. And so what is free will in this whole conversation? Well, free will in standard English means freedom to exercise the will, in other words, to make choices and act upon them, or according to the Longman Dictionary, very interesting definition, the power of choosing without the constraint of divine necessity or causal law. And the free will debate concerns whether or not prior causes guarantee human decisions. And so it focuses the conversation in on human decision making. And so how are we to respond initially to hard determinism? And what I will do is I will respond kind of philosophically to hard determinism, and then we'll begin to unpack some alternative positions. And then we will look at the scientific case for the denial of free will from some studies that happened in the 1980s. And then we will critique those before we finish. So how are we to respond to? Well, we can ask a number of questions that is put forward. Firstly, is it internally coherent? Does it hang together according to its own frames of reference? Secondly, does it help us to make sense of the world that we live in? And thirdly, do we live as though this is true? So let's ask the first question. Is it internally coherent that everything we do is driven by forces beyond our control? Well, on a logical level, this position is self-defeating. You see, Harris asks us not to believe or trust his words, since they are themselves the product of rational forces, non-rational forces, I should say, beyond his control, and therefore they are not his views as such. They come merely from non-physical, from physical forces. And on these grounds, it becomes impossible to say anything meaningful as a hard determinist. It is a self-defeating position to hold. Secondly, does this view help us make sense of the world around us? Well, it really doesn't. It is very inconsistent with the claims to human autonomy that we see all around us. People seem to want to fight for their rights and fight for justice for others and make their own rules and be in control of their lives. And why pursue any of these things if free will is not a thing? And so this view doesn't help us to explain the world that we actually live in. Thirdly, do we live as though free will is an illusion? Well, no, we live as though our choices mean something. If we're driven by forces beyond our control, then can anyone be held morally responsible for their actions, good or bad? And yet we do punish and we reward good and bad behavior precisely on the basis that the person was the bearer of their choice and therefore can be held morally responsible. You see, hard determinism threatens to completely unravel moral responsibility. Komisarjevsky in this, the 4 counts of murder that we began the talk with, was tried and sentenced to 6 life terms without the possibility of release. And yet, if his actions were indeed driven by forces beyond his control, then why punish him at all? And equally, why give medals for bravery? You know, bravery is bravery because the person could have chosen to do otherwise, and yet they didn't. And so this is all to say that we live as though our choices actually mean something. And many would agree that it's not enough to talk simply about non-conscious forces in the brain. We also have a conscious mind. There are 2 different things at play here. There is the brain with its neurons and electrical activity and synapses and chemicals, and then there is the mind with its thoughts and feelings and emotions, decisions, memories. So in addition to a brain, each of us has an inner reality, an inner world, a unique first-person perspective on the world, or as Thomas Nagel put it in 1974, there is something that it is like to be you. We are conscious beings. And how do you get from brain cells to thoughts? I know we could spend all day talking about this question, and really this is where the heart of the whole conversation lies. And this is not a new question. It has occupied philosophers for centuries, and despite throwing the brightest minds at this whole conversation, there is no consensus on how you get from brain cells to thoughts, how you get from non-conscious neurons to consciousness in human beings. But the perspective driving some of this discussion is the view that what seems to us to be a conscious mind is in fact the activity of non-conscious neurons, which is another way of saying there isn't really anything that it is like to be you. There is only your brain. And this view is known broadly as a reductive physicalist approach, where it's saying that the mass is true. What do you think of this view? Well, if we focus in on the conversation around free will, we also learn that there are alternative positions than hard determinism, and these are held by agnostics and atheists alike. So we're not limited simply to the view of hard determinism. One alternative view is compatibilism, or soft determinism. And this view says that, yes, there is a level of determinism in the human brain and the human makeup, but this is also compatible with free will and is known as compatibilism. And so compatibilists believe that humans are determined by prior causes, but they can also act freely when they are not being constrained and when they are seeking to fulfill their desires. And so moral responsibility can still be upheld even in the midst of a degree of determinism. If you think of, to try and illustrate this, if you think of the methods involved in flying a plane, we know that most planes are flown on autopilot, which determines most of the details for the flight. However, the pilot is still able to make decisions from the cockpit without coercion that fulfill his desires for this flight. Decisions like the speed of the plane, the temperature of the cabin, and the general well-being of the passengers. And so here we see both automated processes and free decision-making are working together and are compatible. And this is the heart of this view, compatibilism. Some proponents of this view include people like the 19th century philosopher and atheist David Hume, as does Tufts Professor of Philosophy Daniel Dennett today. And of course, a number of Christians are compatibilists because they believe that God arranges and determines the events of life whilst also enabling certain freedoms. And so in this view, determinism is seen as being compatible with certain freedoms of the will. Another way of looking at this is libertarianism. And a libertarian would say that we always have the ability to choose freely and without constraint. Yes, there may be factors that kind of predispose us to a certain position, or there may be anatomical things that we have that make us influenced in our decision making, but ultimately we always have the capacity to make a free choice independently of those factors, freely and without constraint. Someone like Professor Richard about later would of this kind. And this view would say that Sam Harris would not be doomed to repeat the actions that happened in Connecticut, because the person is the true source of their actions, and they can, in a sense, transcend whatever is happening neuronally and choose freely and bring about alternate possibilities if they had so wished. And I want to spend a few moments highlighting some of the ways in which libertarian and free will is defended by those in favour. And one concept that is really important and really central to the whole conversation is something known as downward causation. We spend a lot of time thinking about how the brain kind of drives so much downwards onto the body and brain and bring about effects and impacts in the brain and body, and this is known as downward causation. There are lots and lots of examples of this, and a famous neuroscience study published in Hippocampus in 2006 by Eleanor Maguire illustrated by comparing the hippocampal size of London taxi drivers with bus drivers. The taxi drivers had to memorize the layout of London, known as the knowledge. The bus drivers didn't, and they compared the size of the hippocampus as these two groups used their memory in different ways. And what they saw is that the hippocampal size in the taxi drivers who were engaging their working memory increased significantly compared with the bus drivers. And this was taken to be evidence of downward causation, where mental processes are having an impact on the body and brain in very significant ways. And we see downward causation actually all the time in life. One example would be the placebo effect, which is a well-documented medical phenomenon. If you are given a blank drug that you believe to be helpful, it will have some therapeutic benefit. it won't necessarily solve the problem, but there is some benefit. Or we could just look at the power of positive thinking, our mindset, or we see this perhaps in things like sports psychology, that matches are lost and won not necessarily on the ability of the person, but on their mental state. You know, when you're 2 sets down in a tennis match and you come back to win the match, you know, your ability isn't in question. It's actually whether you can get yourself into a mental state to sort of come back from that kind of position. And we see this all the time. And so, for example, Malcolm Jeeves, in his book, Minds, Brains, Souls and Gods, says that it's through things like downward causation that mental processes and moral agencies can remain the real sources of behavior, even though they are embodied within a physical and biological system. And so you might ask, well, how exactly can mental processes impact physical systems, especially if those mental processes are non-physical, as would be the case in a dualist position, which I will say more about later. And this is obviously a huge area and an ongoing conversation. And there are lots of different models out there. Just by way of highlight, one of those is something known as Heisenberg's uncertainty. Some libertarians would appeal to quantum theory in trying to make sense of free will, and they would say that at the subatomic level, that the brain is not locked into particular patterns or responses in the same way that it is at the kind of macro level. Subatomic particles behave unpredictably and with a high degree of indeterminacy, and not necessarily according to the same laws that apply to larger structures. And this is known broadly, and I'm sure that I'm kind of oversimplifying it here, but broadly known as Heisenberg's uncertainty. You can't know all of the properties or location or qualities of a subatomic particle at any one moment. And while some quantum physicists may say that these perturbations are just random, some libertarians would say, no, these are not random, these are directed by the mind or the soul, and form a basis for accounting for free will without necessarily needing to introduce anything new into the biological system. There's already an indeterminacy that the mind or soul can direct. And people like Sir John Eccles, who was a well-known neuroscientist and a Christian, was in favor of this theory in defending free will. Some scientists are skeptical of whether this can fully account for it. There have been some indications that quantum changes have led to changes in cell function, but I think it's still a work in progress to see whether quantum changes are large enough to bring about differences in whole biological systems, and that's still very much a work in progress. Another kind of term or language to be used, which is really an extension of downward causation, just putting it in a slightly different way. This is agent causation, which is to say that there is more going on than simply one physical event causing another. There is also something known as agent causation, because people are free agents who can exert causal power in the mind and brain. If we use the example of a domino cascade, we know anyone that has watched it on telly or YouTube will know that the majority of the interaction is from domino to domino. And of course, most of our conversation around free will is taken up, or indeed consciousness, and all of these topics talk about how brain events lead to mental events and mental events lead to brain events. In other words, how one domino causes the downfall of its neighbor. But for a physicalist, dominoes are all that exist, and therefore explanations are restricted to this realm. But what if there are not just domino to domino, but also person to domino interactions. Anyone who has seen a cascade will know that there is one action critical to its success that wasn't simply a domino to domino. It was either a human being or a computer programmed by a human being to set it all going. And in other words, there are different kinds of causation. There is domino to domino, and there is person to domino. And Professor Richard Swinburne makes a distinction between non-intentional causation, in which one event causes another, and intentional causation, in which the cause is more than simply another event. It's caused by a free agent, a person who has a specific intention and exert causal power. And if agent causation is genuine, then libertarian freedom remains viable. And so this view would say brains don't make decisions, people make them as volitional human beings. The will doesn't reside in the brain, but in the mind or the soul, either as, and there are lots of different kind of potential mind-brain models that we could look at. For some, it might be that the mind is an emergent capacity of the physical brain that itself is distinct and not reducible to physics and chemistry. It is greater than the sum of its original building blocks and is able to exert causal power in the body and brain. People such as Malcolm Jeeves or Nancy Murphy at Fuller Seminary would be in favor of this kind of position. Or there is also the view substance dualism, which would say that the mind is beyond the brain. There are two distinct substances. The brain is a physical substance and the mind is a non-physical substance. And these two are distinct, but they interact with each other very closely. And so on those kinds of grounds, people defend libertarian free will. Now, let me move on very briefly in the interests of time, to just address a neurophysiological study which kind of called into question human free will on scientific grounds in the 1980s. You'll probably be aware of Benjamin Libet and his EEG studies, which were begun in 1983. These studies were taken to say that the human brain makes the decision to act before the person is consciously aware of it. By way of very brief summary, volunteers were asked to watch a TV screen in which a spot was rotating. There were electrodes on their head to measure brain activity. And there was an electrode on their finger, and they were asked to bend their finger at a time of their own choosing, but to note the position of the rotating dot at the time they decided to do that. And so they kind of noted that, and all the while are collecting brain EEG data. And what they saw, or what they thought they saw, was that the brain began to fire not just before the person even consciously said that they had decided to move their finger. They saw this readiness potential or Bereitschaft potential. And this was interpreted as evidence that non-conscious acts are initiated unconsciously, even without the person's awareness, and seen as further evidence that the brain is driving human action and decision making. So what can be said in response to Libet's studies is this categorical evidence against free will? Well, there have been many critiques of this study. A brief Google will bring up all kinds of information for you. There's also a Faraday paper from this very institute by the late Peter Clark critiquing Libet's studies. And there are lots of different things that could be said. And I'm just going to kind of briefly summarize those. Firstly, some people did some reanalysis and said, actually, when you reanalyze it according to slightly different models, you get different results. Some people said, look, the averaging, you they averaged the data across 15 volunteers. But when you look at individual people, you begin to see that there isn't this potential before they indicated their decision to move their finger. It's actually occurring at around the same time. And so there might be something in their decision to kind of average all of the data, and they just plot the mean results. Some have reinterpreted, if there is any initial spike, this is a sign that the brain is getting ready to make a decision, because our brain does prepare to make decisions rather than representing the decision itself. Others looked at the effect of having to monitor this rotating dot. Clock monitoring could account for some of this early EEG activity. Jeff Miller and colleagues at the University of Otago looked at this, and they found that if they repeated the study without clock monitoring, you don't see this early potential in the same way. And then others have actually just thought more broadly and asked the question, does one study of motor movement extrapolate to all areas of decision making, including moral ones? Can it really be extrapolated to kind of very complex kind of decision making, such as the ones that were made, that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk? Malcolm Jeeves makes the point in his book, Mind, Brains and Gods, that the overwhelming phenomenological evidence from our daily lives is that we make conscious voluntary decisions that influence the activity of our brains and bodies over minutes, days and years, not milliseconds. There's a sense in which this study might be saying something, but it's on its own, it's not sufficient to completely undermine human free will. Raymond Tallis, a neuroscientist in Manchester and professor, makes the point that the decision to move describes a small movement which is part of a much bigger movement, that of deciding to take part in Dr. Libet's experiment. This involved getting on and off buses, making time for the experiment, and so on. Once all of these other decisions have been taken into account, the risk movement becomes entirely unimportant. The decision to participate in the experiment began not milliseconds, but hours before the experiment began. And so we need to be thinking much more broadly about how we interpret and make sense of this data. And of course, we could look at Michael Shermer, who in Scientific American makes the point that the exercise and neuroscience of free won't is further evidence for free will. So free won't is when we reject a range of options in favor of a particular one. For example, when we exert self-control or resist temptation. So this view says, look, even if impulses do arise in the brain without our conscious awareness, we have the capacity to allow them or stop them. And so cannot simply be at the mercy of our neurons. And so there's a free won't that we have at our fingertips, even if some wouldn't call it free will. And so free won't is veto power over innumerable neural impulses, tempting us to act in one way, such that our decision to act in another way is a real choice. And this has a neuroscientific basis. It's known as inhibitory control, which I could say more about, but a paper published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2007, and indeed many studies published on inhibitory control in healthy volunteers and in various disease states and states of addiction and so on. There are, we have the capacity to, even if we make a decision, to then inhibit that and kind of overrule it. And this, when we do that, certain brain networks light up, including things like the left dorsal frontomedian cortex, which we can see in this diagram. And so this, some argue, was neuroscientific evidence of free won't, and is further evidence in favor of free will. And then finally, Libet himself in 1999 published a paper saying that he does believe in free will as well, and in particular, free won't, and makes the point that the role of conscious free will would be not to initiate a voluntary act, but rather to control whether or not the act takes place. And so there are a number of things that can be said in response to Libet's studies. These results are very interesting. They sparked a lot of very interesting conversation, but they are by no means categorical evidence that free will has been fatally undermined. And actually much of that evidence comes from neuroscientists and from the field of neuroscience itself. And so we've had a kind of a whistle-stop tour really of the conversation around neuroscience and free will. And I think I just want to finish by asking a kind of a broader question, assuming that some people have some degree of freedom of the will, even if Christians and some Christians may disagree about the extent to which that is the case. We could ask the question, in what kind of universe is this most at home? In order to exert causal power and be a free agent, in a sense, a conscious mind is needed from which to make choices and decisions that have causal power in the world. And so what is the best explanation for why that mind exists? And if we are in a material universe of time plus matter plus chance, then human consciousness could have arisen, but it doesn't naturally flow from the starting conditions of non-conscious matter. And similarly, a conscious mind from non-conscious neurons is not intuitive. However, if God exists, then mind and consciousness have been baked into the ingredients of the universe right from the beginning. The arrival of conscious beings on Earth is entirely consistent with the kind of universe that we are in. And this is why many Christians and how they make sense of why we are conscious in the first place. The very first sentence of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this is echoed in the opening verses of John's Gospel that say, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In other words, if God exists, we didn't start with non-conscious cause and effect in matter. We started with a thinking, conscious being, one God in three persons, Father, Son, the Logos, and Holy Spirit. Through this God, all physical things and physical systems were made. And so if God exists, we are not in a closed system of physical processes, but in one in which God, who is spirit, can bring about events in the physical world. And this same God has dignified humans with a meaningful existence so that they are able to make choices that mean something, good or bad. And I wonder what the ultimate reason is that level of a certain level of human freedom has been given. I wonder if it's ultimately so that God himself can be chosen. C.S. Lewis describes his journey from atheism to Christianity in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Having discounted God for much of his life, he begins to change his mind, and he even describes a particular moment of free won't. He says this, the odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. In a sense, I was going up Headington Hill, just around the corner from where I live, incidentally, on the top of a bus, without words, and I think almost without images. A fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out. I felt myself being there and then given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. The choice appeared to be momentous, but it was also strangely unemotional. I was moved by no desires or fears. In a sense, I was not moved by anything. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. I say I chose, yet it did not really seem possible to do the opposite. On the other hand, I was aware of no motives. You could argue that I was not a free agent, but I am more inclined to think that this came nearer to being a perfectly free act than most that I had ever done. And I wonder if this kind of situation is why it's so important to talk about this question. Are we just driven by our neurons? Are there things that just happen that are beyond our control? Do religious people just believe in God because they have a certain anatomy? And I think at the heart of the conversation, the need to preserve the notion that we have meaningful ability to make choices is important, because relationship with God begins partly through human choice. And that makes this whole conversation more important than ever. Thank you for listening.
So, thank you very much indeed, Sharon. That was a very wide-ranging, comprehensive and stimulating talk. Thank you for raising so many questions, as well as providing some answers in various ways. So we have a few questions coming in from our listeners online, and I'm just wondering if anyone in the present audience wants to ask a question. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just pass on to Dr. Dirckx. The first question, one of our listeners has asked, would you say free will is related to having a spirit, that non-anatomical part of us that we believe we have to connect with God, or it may have an anatomical locus or center in the brain yet to be discovered? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think I would want to say that yes, I think that certainly the biblical and Christian view of human beings is that they are both physical beings and they are also spiritual beings, and there are different languages used in the Bible to describe the kind of the spiritual side. We see language of kind of heart and mind and soul, and there are these two things together that are kind of at play, and the view, the perspective there is of holism, that these are not sort of separate entities, but they work in an integrated way, and attempts to kind of separate them and sort of slice human beings up into different segments is to kind of offer a diminished view of human beings. And so, yes, and I think in terms of marrying that with neuroscience, what we want to say is that clearly the actions of the mind that are directed by the person who is body, soul, spirit, all of those things together, is causally connected with events in the brain. And this is not under question. What we clearly see that. The neuroscience has moved away from talking about specific regions to talking about networks, and of course that is the case, that there are whole networks that are recruited even for a very simple task that a person might perform. And so these things are causally connected, not necessarily traceable to just one region, but a whole network. But that doesn't, the fact that they're causally connected doesn't mean the brain activity still can be directed the agent that is able to transcend those physical processes and bring about effects in their body and brain. It does require a particular mind body. Yeah, thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Sharon, very much for that talk. Really interesting. So with my Youth and Schools hat on, for Josephine Average in the classroom, what would you say about the role of the brain in free will?
Sorry, Kathy, could you just say the first bit of that again? Something in the classroom I didn't quite hear.
Yes, so with my Youth and Schools hat on, for Josephine Average in the classroom, what would you say the role of the brain is in free will?
I would say that the brain is causally connected to the decisions that we make as a person, but our decisions are not, our brains are not our decisions. I think that is what it comes down to. I think we make the error of, you know, I think we can be influenced by other things in our brain, and they influence our choices. So we might have, you know, particular, you know, brain surgery that has impacted us, and there's an effect on personality and all kinds of things, or neurodegenerative diseases that affect us in all kinds of ways. But there is still the person sits beyond their kind of neuronal makeup, and therefore is still the bearer of the self, and is able to bring about causal effects in the brain. I think that a frequent error that is made in the sciences, that particularly is something that young people grasp a hold of, is the idea that the science doesn't tell us any more than the fact that these two things are connected. It can't speak to the nature of their relationship, that actually your mind is connected to your brain. And so that leaves the question open, and actually the sciences actually can't answer that. You need philosophy and theology really to begin to think about what is the nature of the relationship between the mind and brain. I probably haven't said that in a succinct enough way to speak to a young person, but do recommend Reboot to them, which is our ministry to young people, to answer their questions in a helpful way as well.
So I kind of try to summarize the answer, Sharon. In a sense, you're saying the brain is acting like the instrument through which our mind operates. And if that instrument is affected in some way physically, that will affect the way it operates, but it's still being acted upon by a higher level consciousness that is, in some way, as you said, emerged from the physical brain.
It could emerge from the brain, or it could sit independently from the brain as a distinct substance and be causally connected to the brain. Yeah, there are other views out there as well. Yeah.
Okay, I've got another question from online, and then we'll come to another human question in the audience here. This is from John, who asks, what researchers' views about how God may influence our thinking directly without having any visual stimulus? Might the mechanism be akin to what he calls EMF radiation? I'm not sure what that is, but EMF radiation, and that's there all the time, but was never discovered until a few centuries ago. Perhaps via the strange way subatomic particles interact in ways we don't yet fully understand, and so something yet to be discovered. So, is there a way in which be influencing our brains by some kind of invisible influence, like a radiation, like electromagnetic radiation, that is invisible, it does have a physical effect?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for the question, John. I think that it certainly it is the case that God does influence our bodies and brains, but I think we have some control over that, and that's part of what it means that we say some people are kind of religious and others aren't. But we do see that when people engage in spiritual activity, everything from Buddhist meditation through to standard prayer and more supernatural types of prayer, we see brain networks lighting up that God is able to kind of influence. And that doesn't mean that the brain activity is the experience, but it means that it's been initiated by something kind of beyond it. And so I think even neuroscience is showing that spiritual engagement can bring about effects in the human brain. And the mechanism for that, I think there are, EMF radiation sounds very interesting. I haven't come across it, but there are lots of different theories that people are exploring. And of course, there is much that we don't understand. I mean, this is a deeply, deeply mysterious area. Yeah, and so I think that this is a work in progress. People have lots of interesting theories to describe the interaction, all just deserve a place on the table for discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll come to the next question from the audience. Of our theory. So the question is free will a kind of subdivision of our spirit?
Subdivision.
I think that I would want to say that the human person has a makeup such that it seems that the will resides in, well, it depends what language you want to use, and different people use different languages. Some would say that the will is a property of the mind and it sits under the umbrella of mind, or some would say that actually it's conscious awareness sits under the umbrella of the soul or the mind. And so I would, yeah, I mean, if you, maybe we mean the same thing. It's a property of a bigger system which all kind of makes up the human being. And it could be helpful, and some people have used the imagery of kind of a diamond, with depending on the way that you shine the light on the human person. The human being is an integrated being, body, soul, mind, spirit, whatever language you happen to use for that. But the angle, if you might shine the light on one particular aspect and see one particular part of what it means to be human. And so free will is one of the parts of what it means to be human, that we have a will that does mean something in the world, that we can make choices that bring about effects in the world. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. Another question here from one of our online viewers. Thanks you for your excellent presentation. But in the Christian context, she asks, how would you conceive of the action of the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Stephanie. So I would say that everything that we have said so far pertains to every human being, that we all have a body, we all have a mind, we all have, in a sense, a spirit with a small s, that there's an inner reality, and we have a heart, soul, mind. And to be a Christian is to allow God to kind of breathe life into all of those things by the Holy Spirit. And so I would see that the Holy Spirit almost as another layer on top of everything that we've said so far. And Jesus talks about the need to be born again. It's actually the life of the Holy Spirit breathes into our physical bodies, our mind, which is exciting, and it's why places like Faraday Institute exist, that it's actually great and actually biblical to be a thinking Christian, and soul and heart and our kind of, so Holy Spirit is another layer that sits on top of all of these things when it comes to human anthropology, in my view.
Here's one more interesting question, and slightly different theme, but what about free will in other animals? And the question goes on to ask, does the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that is mentioned in Genesis, does that knowledge of good and evil represent our transition from animal into being human, or is it more a matter of moving along a continuum? Do the animals have free will?
Oh, gosh, yes, a nice easy one to finish with. Thank you. So yes, I think, thank you for the question. I think that perhaps I could speak to this from the view of consciousness. I mean, if we assume that you need to be conscious in some level in order to exercise a will, you need to have an awareness of things, certainly your environment, possibly yourself, but in humans, in order to exercise free will. I think if we look at the animals, they seem to have awareness of their external environment, but the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that they have consciousness to the same degree that humans are. They don't have a reflexive self-awareness. It doesn't seem like animals kind of wonder why they're a canine wonders why he's a dog and not a cat, or I mean, we don't know because they don't have the same semantic language to tell us, but that only illustrates another difference between animals and humans, that they don't have language to the same extent. that we do. And so I would want to argue that animals have levels of consciousness, but they don't have the same level of consciousness that we do. Even the most advanced primate, even though they can perform some tasks that are similar to what what humans can do, they will never exceed the ability of a 4-year-old child, according to some behavioral scientists. And they will only achieve that if an image bearer trains them, if a human being trains them. However, this is an interesting area, and it may be that there is, to some extent, because they do have some level of consciousness, they have a level of will. But I probably have said all I can on that topic.
One sort of interesting aspect of that there was a paper published in Nature about 15 years ago, I think, by someone called Heisenberg, actually, who was related to the Heisenberg who you quoted, and he did a study of insect reactions and discovered that he showed empirical data that even insects make spontaneous movements, and they aren't solely determined by external stimuli, so that even insects could, in a sense, make free choices which way to jump. But that was an interesting sideline. Whether an insect counts as an animal or not was another thing. But clearly, he was showing that living organisms don't have to simply respond to external stimuli in a deterministic way. That there's a certain freedom of choice, even for a very small living creature. And there's another aspect here in terms of some questions coming in related to the analogy with computing. And one of them here says, could we account for free will without having to have a supernatural cause? And from an evolutionary point of view, you could justify consciousness in terms of it providing us with a model of the world that has some objectivity and is therefore useful in helping us to survive, and would therefore necessarily have some independence in the physical processes underlying it. Or rather, the logic could drive the physics, just as a computer reacts to software, not just hardware. That's quite a long question, sorry.
No, is this the, oh yes, I see it here. Yes, I mean, I think the, of course, there are many attempts to account for free will without a supernatural cause, and there are a number of ways to account for things evolutionarily. It does raise a question as to whether evolution on its own can provide an adequate justification for why self-awareness would be the product of that process, if the goal is kind of gene honing and adaptation and survival. And you need certainly to be aware of your context, but do you need to be self-aware in quite the same way? So I certainly know that there are kind of persuasive models out there trying to do that, but would just ask a question: what is the most persuasive account? What has the greatest explanatory power of why we have this awareness of ourselves and are able to think abstract thoughts? Does that sit well within a materialistic evolutionary framework, or is it better accounted for in a theistic framework that started with mind and consciousness at the beginning? So it would be a question for me of the inference to the best explanation. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I mean, there's a whole stream of questions coming in here, Sharon, and I think that's testament to the stimulating nature of your talk today, that you have raised so many thoughts and questions in our minds. I want to thank those of you who sent questions in, and for those of you who asked questions here in the audience. That's a very helpful contribution to our discussion and our thinking together. And thank you, Sharon, for a clearly very stimulating presentation. And I want to just finish by reminding everyone of the next seminar, which is coming up in 2 weeks' time. That will be on Tuesday, the 8th of February. You can find all the details of our upcoming seminars on the Faraday website. But in 2 weeks' time, same time on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, Professor Steve Ferber of the University of Manchester will be speaking on brains, minds, and artificial intelligence, implications for faith and ethics. So a continuation along a similar theme for today's seminar. And we look forward to seeing you then in 2 weeks' time. But thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.